Scientists spent decades trying to explain where Filipinos came from, and for a long time the answer seemed straightforward. A farming people sailed south from Taiwan about 4,000 years ago, settled the islands, and became the ancestors of modern Filipinos. Clean, simple, and almost completely wrong. When researchers began pulling apart the actual genetic data hidden inside Filipino blood, they found something that defied every model they had built: fragments of an extinct human species that vanished from the fossil record. DNA signatures connecting Filipinos to Siberia, to Polynesia, to the Arabian Peninsula, and to pre-colonial China. Ancient hunter-gatherer lineages that somehow survived 50,000 years of migrations, invasions, and colonial destruction. Filipino DNA is not just complex. By several scientific measures, it is the most layered human genetic record on Earth, and understanding why changes everything we thought we knew about the ancient history of Asia. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and leave a like so more people can find this content. Now let us get into it. The Philippine archipelago sits at the edge of the Asian continent, broken into more than 7,000 islands separated by deep ocean trenches. Those trenches matter more than most people realize. Even during the last ice age, when sea levels dropped dramatically and land bridges connected many parts of Southeast Asia, the deepest channels around the Philippines stayed underwater. That geographic isolation created something unique. It turned the islands into a kind of evolutionary laboratory where human populations developed separately from one another for thousands of years, preserving genetic traits that disappeared almost everywhere else on the planet. The oldest confirmed human presence in the Philippines dates back at least 67,000 years, based on butchered animal bones found in Kalinga province in northern Luzon. But the most extraordinary discovery came in 2019, when researchers studying small fossilized bones recovered from Calao Cave formally announced the existence of a previously unknown human species. They named it Homo luzonensis. The bones showed a mosaic of features, some resembling modern humans, others matching much older ancestors like Homo erectus, and still others that matched Australopithecines, a group most scientists believed had gone extinct in Africa long before any human reached Asia. The species lived in Luzon at least 50,000 years ago and possibly much longer. Nobody knows exactly what happened to them, whether they were absorbed into later populations, whether they went extinct from competition, or whether disease or climate wiped them out. What scientists do know is that they were here, and the question of whether their genes entered the modern Filipino population is one that researchers are actively investigating. Then there is the Denisovan question, and this is where Filipino genetics becomes genuinely strange. The Denisovans were an archaic human group closely related to Neanderthals. They left almost no fossils, just a few bone fragments found in a single cave in Siberia and one jawbone found in Tibet. But they left enormous amounts of DNA inside the genomes of living people, and nowhere on Earth is that Denisovan signal stronger than in the Philippines. Among the Aita Magbukon people of Luzon, scientists confirmed in a 2021 study published in the journal Current Biology that approximately 5% of their genome traces back to Denisovan ancestors. That is the highest confirmed Denisovan ancestry in any living human population, higher than in Papua New Guinea, higher than in Aboriginal Australians, higher than anywhere else scientists have measured. What makes this even more striking is that the Denisovan DNA found in Filipinos does not match the Denisovan DNA found in other Asian populations. The genetic signatures are different, which strongly suggests that people in the Philippines interbred with a separate Denisovan population that has not been identified from the fossil record. In other words, there may have been a distinct group of Denisovans living in Southeast Asia, whose existence we know about only because their genes survived inside the bodies of people living in the Philippine mountains today. some of that ancient DNA may not be neutral. Researchers have identified specific Denisovan-derived gene variants in Southeast Asian populations that appear to influence immune function, metabolism, and the ability to process certain foods. These traits may have provided survival advantages in tropical island environments, which could help explain why natural selection preserved them across 50,000 years of history. Before we go further, if you are finding this as fascinating as I am, drop a like and share this video. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and we have a lot more ground to cover. Around 4,000 years ago, something changed. A new population began moving southward out of Taiwan, carrying with them domesticated rice, domesticated pigs, pottery with distinctive red-slipped surfaces, and a family of languages that would eventually become the most geographically widespread language group in human history. These were the Austronesians, and their expansion into the Philippines was one of the largest and most consequential human migrations of the past 10,000 years. Archaeological sites in northern Luzon contain clear physical evidence of their arrival. Tools, ornaments, and pottery styles that match finds in Taiwan almost exactly, appearing in the Philippine record with no gradual transition, suggesting a relatively fast migration rather than a slow drift. What the genetics show, however, is more complicated than a simple replacement. The Austronesians did not arrive to empty islands. They encountered populations whose ancestors had been living in the Philippines for tens of thousands of years, and the result was not conquest, but mixing. Modern Filipinos carry both lineages simultaneously. Populations in lowland and coastal areas carry heavier Austronesian ancestry, reflecting centuries of contact with trade networks and agricultural expansion. Populations in highland and forest regions carry stronger signals of the older hunter-gatherer ancestors. The ratio shifts depending on geography, but both layers are present in virtually every Filipino genome that has been tested. The Austronesian contribution is dominant in most population-level statistics, but the older strands never disappeared. Linguistically, the Austronesian legacy is even clearer. More than 170 languages spoken in the Philippines today belong to the Austronesian family. Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, Hiligaynon, and dozens of others all trace their grammatical structures and core vocabulary back to the same Taiwanese root. Words for rice cultivation, for parts of an outrigger canoe, for basic kinship terms, these all carry Austronesian origins. That linguistic uniformity spread across 7,000 islands is itself evidence of how thorough the Austronesian expansion was, and how effectively it reorganized the social and economic landscape of the archipelago. Long before any European ship appeared on the horizon, the Philippines was embedded in a trading world that stretched from the South China Sea to the edges of the Pacific Ocean. Archaeologists have recovered Chinese ceramics in Filipino burial sites dating back to the 9th century, centuries before the Spanish arrived. Indian glass beads, bronze drums matching styles found in mainland Southeast Asia, and obsidian tools traced to sources in Borneo have all turned up in Philippine archaeological contexts. These are not occasional finds, they represent sustained, organized exchange networks that connected the archipelago to the broader Asian world for over 1,000 years before colonization. The genetic record reflects this. Scattered throughout Filipino genomes are faint but detectable signals of Chinese ancestry, most likely reflecting centuries of intermarriage between Chinese traders and local populations in coastal trading towns. Similar faint signals suggest contact with populations from the Indian subcontinent, consistent with the historical presence of Indian-influenced trading states in maritime Southeast Asia. Genetic studies have also identified weak connections between certain Philippine populations and groups in Polynesia and Micronesia, suggesting that the ocean routes crossing the Philippine Sea were traveled in multiple directions over many centuries. The Philippines was not a passive recipient of outside influence. It was an active participant in one of the most complex maritime trading systems the ancient world produced. The Lingling O jade ornaments found across the Philippines and traded throughout Southeast Asia are among the clearest physical symbols of that regional integration, crafted from nephrite jade sourced from Taiwan and later from local deposits in northern Luzon. These ornaments circulated through networks stretching from Vietnam to Borneo. Their presence in burial sites across the region speaks to both the trading reach of Philippine communities and the social prestige attached to cross-sea exchange. When Ferdinand Magellan reached the Philippines in 1521 and Miguel López de Legazpi established the first permanent Spanish settlement in 1565, they did not encounter a genetically uniform population. They encountered the accumulated product of 50,000 years of migration, mixing, and exchange. The Spanish colonial period added another genetic layer on top of everything that came before, though the nature of that layer was uneven and geographically specific. In Manila and the major coastal cities, Spanish and later Mexican influence was substantial. The Manila galleon trade, which ran from 1565 to 1815, brought not only silver from Mexico and silk from China, but also soldiers, administrators, and settlers from New Spain who married into local populations and left descendants. The term mestizo emerged to describe people of mixed Filipino and Spanish ancestry, and later mixed Filipino and Chinese ancestry, since the Chinese merchant community in Manila, known as the Sangli, intermarried with local Filipinos at high rates throughout the colonial period. DNA studies of populations in Manila and other major urban centers do show elevated frequencies of East Asian genetic markers beyond what would be expected from Austronesian ancestry alone, consistent with this history of Chinese integration. Spanish genetic markers are also present but more diluted, partly because Spanish colonizers were never numerically dominant, and partly because many of the men who came from Spain did not leave large numbers of descendants relative to the existing population. The Spanish colonial period also reshaped Filipino identity in ways that extended far beyond genetics. Catholicism became the dominant religion of the lowlands, replacing or overlaying animist traditions that had been present for thousands of years. The Spanish reorganized settlements, imposed tribute systems, introduced new crops including corn, tomatoes, and cacao brought from the Americas, and created an administrative structure that persisted well into the modern period. The genetic mixing that occurred during this era was real but selective. It affected urban and coastal populations most directly and left the highland and forest communities largely untouched. The most genetically significant populations in the Philippines are not the ones most people have heard of. They are the indigenous communities who avoided sustained contact with Austronesian farmers, colonial administrators, and global trade networks alike, preserving genetic signatures that would otherwise have been diluted beyond detection. Groups including the Aita, the Agta, the Ati, and other Negrito populations across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao carry the oldest traceable ancestry in the Philippine genetic record. Their lineages connect directly to the first wave of modern humans who reached Southeast Asia more than 50,000 years ago, predating the Austronesian expansion by tens of thousands of years. The 2021 study that measured Denisovan ancestry in the Aita Magbukon was part of a broader genomic survey of indigenous Philippine populations. That research confirmed that Philippine Negrito groups carry a combination of deep ancient ancestry and Denisovan-derived DNA that makes them genetically distinct from any other living population on the planet. Importantly, the study also found that this ancient DNA was not simply preserved by chance. These populations maintained it through thousands of years of relative isolation, resisting both genetic and cultural assimilation despite surrounding pressures. the Cordillera mountain range in northern Luzon, and the dense forests of Palawan, Mindanao, and Negros all functioned as natural refuges that protected these communities from the homogenizing effects of agricultural expansion and colonial rule. The Ifugao rice terraces, carved into the mountains of the Cordillera and recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, are a direct product of that isolation. They represent an agricultural system developed independently of lowland Austronesian farming traditions, adapted specifically to the terrain of communities that had no intention of coming down from the mountains. The cultural and biological distinctiveness of these highland groups is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate choices made over many generations to remain separate, and those choices preserved something irreplaceable. Filipino DNA is strange because Filipino history is layered in ways that most national histories are not. It begins with archaic humans living in caves before modern Homo sapiens had fully spread across Asia. It runs through the Denisovan interbreeding events that left the highest confirmed ancient human ancestry in any living population on Earth. It carries the Austronesian expansion that rewrote the linguistic and agricultural map of the Pacific. It absorbs centuries of Chinese, Indian, Arab, Spanish, and Mexican contact through trade routes and colonial systems. And underneath all of that, it preserves the oldest human genetic signatures in Southeast Asia, inside communities that survived every wave of outside influence intact. No single origin story explains what Filipino DNA is. The science requires multiple stories, multiple timelines, and multiple peoples, all of them real, all of them present in the genomes of Filipinos living today. That is not a complication. That is the point. The genetic complexity is the history. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. Give this video a like, share it with someone who would find it interesting, and subscribe if you want more content like this. Every one of those actions genuinely helps this channel, and there is a lot more coming.